right. Well, glad that you're here this morning. Thanks for being with us online, in person, whichever way you're tracking with us today. Coming off of a week where I had an unfortunate mishap with a Brita water filter. Yes, at an Airbnb. I am well, and so is the Airbnb. You need not worry about whether or not deposits or cleaning fees were amplified. But what I did do was misjudge the Brita water filter technique with this particular moment. You see, I was loading in the groceries, and I decided to effectively multitask, which, I think you who do that know that you can get yourself into some scraps that way. Decided I was going to fill up that Brita water filter because it's well water in southeastern Ohio where dreams come true, so filling up the Brita, I decided to put away groceries and do some other things, and not really realizing that the Brita water filter, which is supposed to be filtering the water, was in fact not filtering the water. And so, and we had kind of a little mess there on the countertop that made its way to the floor. None of us were harmed in the end, but it's a metaphor, I actually think, that may describe how you may feel today. It may be that it's very possible, in fact, that just the deluge of things happening around you, in the world, in the city, in your family, as you're prepping for Thanksgiving, whatever it is, the work responsibilities, it's just coming at a faster volume that you can process. It just feels that way today. So maybe you come into this room, you're just feeling a little heavy, you're feeling a little overwhelmed, you're feeling a little just unable to know, I don't know one more thing to care about in the world. I don't know if I have the capacity to find out about one more tragic thing happening or one more heavy thing happening. But then what's also maybe true for you, which is kind of what we talked about the last 4 weeks with Jonah, is that your ability to effectively filter that, or your inability to effectively filter those things, are paying some consequences. They may be doing something to the people around you, one passive-aggressive comment at a time. But they may also be doing something just in your own spirit, one that you can even detect. Man, I just am carrying an angst about me that I'm just seeing come out in interactions with neighbors or interactions with kids or driving north on 83 where just, everyone else is a terrible driver and I'm the only one that gets it. I don't know what it is for you. But what we've tried to do in the past month is in looking at this character, Jonah, who does have this amazing thing God does through him, also take a minute to pay attention to the things that were happening in him in the course of that story. And then just flipping the pages of the scriptures over to the book of Micah, which is a more traditional minor prophet in the Bible in terms of its literary format. Pay attention to, if you did come in today and that little Brita water filter anecdote feels or resembles where you might be, how do we begin to process or deal with that? And so this beautiful text buried in the book of Micah speaks to a larger thing the book of Micah actually wants to present, which is, hey, there is a heaviness, there are things happening in the world, but God is working, God is moving, God is providing, God is rescuing, God is bringing justice forth, but what do you do in the meantime? What do you do when you're the one picking up carpool and you're just harried and feeling a little bit overwhelmed by it all? Or when you're the person that everyone's turning to and what's the plan for Thanksgiving? Or you're trying to solve hundreds of years of generational neglect as in the context of a city. Or have a hot take about geopolitical conflict that you've read about, but you're not really sure about. So we're going to look at the book of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8, but we're going to do that over the course of 3 weeks. And take these themes of justice and humility and mercy and try to treat them almost like that three-legged stool that would work together. Because if we pursue justice without having a spirit of mercy or humility, we're not exactly going to be very pleasant people to be around. But if we're just people that are merciful, but we don't actually think through the picture of justice, then we may not embody the love of Jesus, who is the embodiment of grace and truth. So let's take a look at Micah chapter 6, verse 8, one more time, and then we'll unpack this idea of justice together in our few minutes together this morning. Micah chapter 6, verse 8 says this: "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." It's a beautiful verse. It's worthy of your coffee cup or your inspirational Instagram canvas. But it's also much more beautiful than that, because it actually speaks to that stupid little anecdote I led off with, right? How to process the heaviness of the deluge of things that you're doing, and how to filter well the deluge of those things through the lens of the love of God. Let's think together well of what it means to act justly. Let's begin with the idea that this idea of justice is actually pretty ripe in the scriptures. I think it's important that you know that this idea of acting justly is not just appearing one time in one verse buried in the middle of the Bible. That from the beginning of the Bible to the conclusion of the Bible, the theme of there is a just and orderly world that has been fractured by sin and rebellion and exploitation, and God has not been silent on that. God is working to bring the restoration of all things. That's a movement of the scriptures. So we don't have just this peripheral idea, I grew up in the 90s where when I started going to church, there was kind of a phrase and a movement of what would Jesus do? Right? You remember that? And there were bracelets that went along with it. I wore a "What Would Jesus Do" bracelet, and I remember one time going, I was having an ethical dilemma that I was like, I don't know that Jesus ever had to think about what kind of movie to go see. What do I do with that? Silly anecdote. But still, I think it's important for us to consider that justice is not just a Micah 6:8 conversation. It's a whole Bible conversation. And really, if we're going to I want to bring to the conclusion in Revelation chapter 21, verses 2 through 4. I'll read it in just a minute. But I'll define it this way. Justice is, I like Chris Moorman's definition of this. Justice is God rightly ordering all things. Right? If you take what was set up by God in infinite justice and character, then what was fractured by mankind, take the idea of Genesis 3:15, that God is making war on that God is trying to rescue that which has been fractured, using people like you, bringing the Messiah to bring all of these things to bear. So I look at Revelation chapter 21, verses 2 through 4, where it says, "I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" And you can very plainly look at that verse and say to yourself what I might say: not today. Not today. Because I got all kinds of things I want to weep about. Some of them are pretty inane and silly, but some of them are pretty reflective of a world where the arc of justice, as Martin Luther King said, is moving quite slowly. It's moving, but it's not moving at the brand of efficiency with which I might like it to. If you look at the Old Testament, there's two words that are used almost 200 times to define justice. There's a word tzaddik, which is really kind of the right ordering of things. So justice meaning this is the right ordering of how we're going to do things, right? If you're hosting a Thanksgiving meal and you want to do it real formal, what's the structure for how it's supposed to go? We pass the potatoes to the left. We make sure the salad fork is in the proper place. Everyone has a half pour of water, not 3/4 of a pour, right? Whatever you would do. Right? It speaks to the idea of right ordering. Tzaddik says this is how God, who is the embodiment of justice, who is without limits, who is in the character of justice, the definition of justice. This is how God would rightly order things. That's Sadiq. But mishpat acknowledges a reality, which is the word that's actually used here in Micah 6:8, that it's not always going that way. And when it doesn't always go that way, what is the role of a person who cares about God's picture of justice? The word mishpat points to retributive justice, like, hey, you did this to me, so this is what we got to do to make that right, to the king or the point of accountability, hey, the wrongdoer, but also to the one who's been wronged, to the poor, to the vulnerable, to the widow, to the orphan, to the sojourner, the one that the king was supposed to protect, Sadiq, the one they exploited for their own benefit. So what do? Mishpat. Sometimes they work together, which is the definition. If you think about the phrase social justice, when in the Old Testament you see those two words working together. How do we socially and relationally engage? So you'll see a phrase that's used varying times in the scriptures, about 36 in total in the Old Testament, that says just and right, which is like, how do we socially try to work and affect the change that like restores things back to the way that they're supposed to be, knowing that that's, you're human. You can't do it in full. So why am I giving you this long diatribe on Hebrew? I think it matters. I think it matters that we know that this picture of justice should begin with God. Our picture of justice begins with God. Like C.S. Lewis talked about this, right? Like C.S. Lewis talked about this idea of like, where did your definition of right and wrong come from? Like if I'm coming at you with a cup of boiling water, even if we don't speak the same language and we don't come from the same place, but I'm like coming at you with a cup of boiling water and I'm gonna like dump it on your head, you're like, whoa, cowboy, what are you doing? Like there's something in you ingrained to say, that's not right. We don't do that to each other. That's not a thing that humans do. Like we're gonna play nice, so we're not gonna do that with boiling water. Lewis says, where does that come from? It comes from something ingrained in you, part of being made in God's image, that says, hey, something's wrong here. But that same definition of like something's wrong here can be corrupted by your own humanity, right? By what happens when you get the ring of power. By what happens when, when I'm in charge here, we're going to do things different, and then you're like, it kind of benefits me to do things the way that they've always been done. So if we're going to think about the picture of justice, it behooves us to know that this Micah 6:8 conversation is not just some random sidebar buried in the scriptures, that this is like a whole approach, first of all, for who God is, God's character, God's heart, but also the work of God's people. The picture of justice and the carrying out of justice begins with God, not just ourselves and not just our own way of doing things. And so let's think about that in this sense, right? That acting justly then might actually mean that we allow God's picture of justice to impact our pictures of justice. Right? The work of doing justice, in part, the theological work that we all have to do, all of us, whether you know as much Hebrew as I know, which is sort of like enough to be dangerous, or you're like a scholar, or you're like, I don't even know what language you're talking about, bro. This idea is that we've got to take this word justice and on some level, right, this conversation about how to do justice well begins with us submitting our picture of justice to God's picture. And to say, hey, where is there alignment? Where can I be encouraged? Where like C.S. Lewis's example, can I go, wow, something's wrong in the world and we got to do something about that? And then where does my own sin, does my own humanity, right? Does my own limits, does my own hurt, how's my hurt gotten in the way of my ability to see justice rightly? In 1996, the Orioles were robbed of Game 1 of the ALCS when a 12-year-old kid reached over into the glove of Tony Tarasco and took away a home run. They made a home run out of what was an out. Would have been an out. He would have caught the ball. I'm holding to it, right? And I was 16 years old, I'm fired up and I'm burned up and I'm like, baseball just wants the Yankees in the World Series. They do. This great tragic injustice has happened. I'm like, this is wrong. This is persecution to the city of Baltimore. I just was lit up. I was going to school the next day, cruising Smithsburg High School, looking for someone with a Yankees hat on. You'd be like, I'm coming for you, man, right? A few years ago, meaningless, season game, Orioles player hits a ball to left field, Camden Yards, not before, the left field wall now is 400 feet high and 400 yards back, but it was pretty accessible at the time. And Orioles player hits a ball to left field, opposing player goes up to get the ball, Orioles fan reaches over and grabs the ball. Fan interference is called on the field, runners out. What do you think my posture was? My posture was not, it's very good that they finally have the technology to get that call right. My posture was, where were you in 1996, bro? Where were you in 1996 when I needed you to do that particular thing, right? My picture of justice was corrupted by my orange and black colored glasses. That is a very inane metaphor for something that's very, very true on a deep and personal part of your heart. That you've been through some things that make it very difficult for you to assume positive intentions about certain groups of people that might be harmful. That you've been through some things that take what maybe for some of us in this room on a scale of 1 to 10 is yeah, that's a problem, that's a 5, but for you it's a 13. And it's not even that that's bad or wrong, it's just that it's a thing. And if not checked and not paid attention to, it's going to carry over into some really dangerous places. Anger can be a really good thing for us, right? It's that thing that says, something's wrong and I have the capacity to fix it. But it's also the thing that goes, man, I'm going to take justice into my own hands. I'm going to come in and try to solve the problem with Scott's picture of justice style. And that might actually bring more harm and hurt to myself, the cause I represent, and the people I'm actually trying to help. That duplicity exists in you as it exists in me. It exists in all of us, right? Remember last week when Jonah is so upset about what's happened in Nineveh, that he is weeping about the death of a plant that's covering him, but he does not weep, he does not blink at the idea of 120,000 people being lit up on fire because a few people have hurt him and hurt their people. And so God's is it right for you to be angry about the plant? And he says, it is. Really angry, I wish I was dead. So angry, I wish I was dead. That's jarring. But I think that's also you and me somewhere. Somewhere where there's a right thing. We've been wronged. You've been hurt. You've been harmed. Something's not okay that happened around you or to you. But if we don't bring that picture of justice to God and let it refine us and speak to us and challenge us, we might take it to some difficult and terrible places, to be frank. Isaiah chapter 61, verse 8 says, "For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. In my faithfulness, I will reward my people and make an everlasting covenant with them." But I'll just be real honest with you. When we don't always get the instant gratification of an injustice being fixed, we begin to wonder, God, do you even see? God, do you even care? The scriptures say, yeah, I love justice. I hate robbery and I hate wrongdoing. But what we'll often do is justify our robbery and justify our wrongdoing through the lens of the justice that we don't feel like we're getting. And it can take us to some really heavy places. can take us to some really disproportionate expressions of hurt and harm. Proverbs 14:31 says, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. I think that allowing God's picture of justice here to move us to say, God's pretty clear in the Bible that God has a real heart for the poor. And God has a real heart for the people that exploit the poor. But if you're anything like me, sometimes you don't want to know or think about the ramifications of where a sweater came from, or how that little iPhone got into your pocket, or you just want to go like, I don't want to think about that stuff, because if I had to think about that stuff, then I might actually have to think about that stuff. And what the scriptures are calling us to consider is like, no, like it's pretty core to God's heart that like the trail of things behind you, like in terms of our approach, like it should raise some questions. It should make us think about those things, as uncomfortable as those things might be. Allowing our picture of justice to impact our picture, be impacted by God's picture of justice. Abraham Lincoln had this famous quote, you've probably heard it before, where he was, sort of everybody in the United States was sort of co-opting what God's heart for the nation was circa 1861 to 1865. And what he said was this. He said, sir, my concern is not whether God is on our side. My concern is to be on God's side, for God's always right. Right? And here's what we know. Here's what we know. We can make the Bible say a whole lot of things, dangerously so, if we're just interested in making it agree with us. But the movement of a disciple of Jesus is to say, Lord, I do come with my humanity. I do come with my brokenness. I do come with my story. I do come with my experiences. But how does your word and how does your love walk with me in grace and truth so that I can actually reflect your heart for justice in people? For the people around me, for the people that have wronged me, for the hot takes that are happening around me. How do I align myself to what God is doing in the world? Letting my prayer life not just be the echo chamber of, God, I'm going to tell you all the things that are wrong with how you're doing it. But also, I can do that, and I should do that. Those are called the imprecatory psalms. But also, as I'm doing that, how am I letting God's love shape and stoke my picture of justice? It also means surrounding ourselves, acting justly, surrounding ourselves with a community of people pursuing justice together. So last week we got this little inner monologue, this glimpse into the life of Jonah. And here's what I think you probably know and I probably know is that the things we've uttered to our dashboard or our shower, we're really grateful. A lot of them aren't recorded in like scripture and dispersed through the world. And you get a glimpse here of a thing Jonah said out loud that is like a fairly embarrassing thing, right? And like if you were Jonah's friend, you might say this. I don't know what you would say. Some of you that are just like, maybe you don't have a lot of time for nonsense, you might just say like, bro, grow up. But some of you are like a real heart, you're really empathetic and like, tell me more about why you're sad about that plant. And you would be like lovingly stoking Jonah to be like, hey, there's like 120,000 people that you're just wanting to see burn. Maybe that's bad. That's bad. I know, the plant, sunburn's rough. I'm a ginger. I get it, right? If we go back to Micah chapter 6, verse 8, where it says, he has shown you what is good, to act justly and to love mercy. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? Act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God. I think this first part, I should have had it just a second ago when it's like, hey, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. Right? Like in this conversation about what it means to do good in the world, one of the challenges of our time in the moment is like we don't really have even a phrase like, well, everyone just be a good human. Well, if you don't have an agreed upon definition of good, and you don't have an agreed upon definition of human, and you don't have an agreed upon definition of then it's really challenging. It's messier than that. It's messier than just like, we'll just be a good human. So we need a group of people wrestling with those things with us. This is what I'm saying. because you are mortal. You are tired, you are hungry, you are angry, you get lonely, you've been betrayed, and it's really simple for any one of us to get triggered to a place where our picture of justice is weaponized in a way that will do harm to the people around us. So what does it mean to be a community of people, this is the church, where we can wrestle with the idea of justice together? Where we can say lovingly to one another, I get that issue is really core to your heart. Have you considered this? And here, I just want to say this, what I'm not talking about is just listening to sermons. Because a lot of the things we're talking about here, in terms of what does it mean to do justice as a body of people, is in our complement of one another, right? Some of you are systems thinkers. Some of you are heart people. Some of you are all head, and you're like, no heart. I don't even have time for a heart. I'm heartless. Others of you are like, just tell me what to do and I'll build something really cool and we'll do justice together. We need everybody doing that work together and wrestling with that work together. And I don't know if you know this, but it seems like the places where we can wrestle well with what it means to do justice together are diminishing. Places where we can have conversations that are potentially embarrassing, or we can ask questions that are like, how could you say such a thing? They're diminishing. And so what this church has to be, and what the church has to be, is a place where we can wrestle with the implications of justice together. Taking the scriptures, but also our experiences, and also the way in which we're uniquely wired, and bringing those things to bear in one another's story, right? And if we do that well, I think sometimes it'll encourage some of us to speak up, right? There'll be someone that says, hey, I just want to tell you, you have a unique voice. You've been through something that I haven't been through, so you speaking to that issue is really important. Sometimes it'll call us to speak up. Sometimes it'll call us to shut up. Hey, dude that speaks into microphones for 30 minutes at a time for a living, in part of what his living anyway, you don't have to be the word or of authority on every one of these things that are, there are people in our community that may have a better read on something. And so listen well. Sometimes we need to hear from one another. If you're new to Baltimore, it's good to hear from someone that's lived in Baltimore for about 40 years. If you lived in Baltimore for 40 years and you've just sort of normalized some of the nonsense that goes on, it's good to hear from people that are fresh and are like, help me make sense of this thing that makes no sense to me because I didn't come from this. And you didn't, where you're tempted to go, that's just Baltimore, hon. to really hear. We need to be, being a church means not just nodding our head to sermons about justice, but committing ourselves to bringing ourselves to those conversations, which is his way of saying, we need you in those conversations. We need your presence. We need your story. We need your perspective. But then I also think it also just helps us to know when to step out. When to just know, hey, you're overwhelmed right now. That's a lot. There's a lot on your plate. Sometimes, I don't know if any of you are like this, but some of us don't set limits very well. And sometimes we need a group of people that can look at us and say, hey, we got this. You take a breath. Not because your voice isn't important, but because you're exhausted. And this is not something we're going to solve with one tweet. It's not something that we're going to solve with one service project. It's not something that we're going to solve with one killer sermon about that topic. We need to be that kind of community together. And I think to act justly means to take that individual heart work of doing the work of justice and letting God's picture of justice impact our picture of justice, but then letting that wash over and be in community with one another to do it well. And then lastly, it actually means to do the work of justice, this to act justly, right? Not just to talk about justice, not just that we choose action over slogans. Not that slogans and memorable campaigns are not important, but that we actually on some level begin to do the work on some level. right? To not just have intellectual arguments about what is wrong with Baltimore and how does one fix it, but to actually step out and begin to do those things. It's easy to have hot takes about a number of issues that you have no intention of playing any role in solving, whether it's through time or money or whatever. And like the word slacktivism is one that's been sort of attributed to that, right? Like I can have big opinions about something that I have no idea or desire to do anything about. How do we actually choose action? And this is challenging in this way, and this is where we're going to land. Because I think for a lot of us, this is why we choose what I'll jokingly call slacktivism, or just, hey, let's do a service project and it'll solve it, is like, it's really overwhelming, right? When you think about things like climate, or you think about things like restoring generational, like what do I do about generational poverty, and what do I do about solving the issue of homeless? Like we can so just like get so paralyzed by thinking about it. We're like, nope. I just want to choose the easiest thing that will solve the problem today, or make me feel like I've done my thing. And and that's important, but again, back to the idea of like doing that long work means to have a long arc and a long view, and to continue to do our part well, which I'll put back on needing a community to help you stay in it, or step out of it, or take a break from it. Because courtesy of the internet, we can get some likes really quickly, we can spend some money really quickly, but some of the things that really require this mishpat justice are things that are not going to be solved with a tweet or a $10 contribution. And that's where the church needs to be, but often is not. And so that's why in Amos, God's like, yeah, I like your festivals. I don't like your festivals, your singing. No, I got no time for that. Do the work of justice. That's why in Luke chapter 14, verses 12 to 13, Jesus is like, hey, if you're having a party, and like invite the people that where it's actually going to cost you something to invite them. Like, don't just invite the influencers, and don't just invite the people, right? This is the equivalent of like the middle schoolroom, right? When you walk into the room and you're not just looking at the room and going, where in this room do I build my social clout? But you walk into that room and go, hey, where in this room can I bring my story to help someone else's story? But there's like still that inner middle schooler in each of us going, how do I look at the world and sort of use it to like just be okay today? But the invitation of the work of justice is to say, how do I take the things I've been given today, as limited and as small as I might feel, and I step back out into this world and go, my money, my time, my clout, how can I be about that work that God is going to be about today? And like, easier said than done, right? We didn't solve it. We're done and we didn't solve it. But here's where communion comes in. That it's in Jesus, right? The completed work of Christ that says, like, when you feel weary and tired and burdened from the nonsense happening to you and around you, here's a place to come back to and feel refreshed. Here's who moves towards you. And if you're weary and you're exhausted and you're angry, even in your most core relationships, let the way Jesus has moved towards you just speak to you today. Remember that. Rest in that. Let it refresh you. And as you partake of bread and cup, let it move you to consider who needs that same refreshment. And how can what's happening in my own heart lead me to love others well? What we celebrate in communion is that we don't have to operate out of the scarcity of not having a Savior willing to do that work in our story. We can operate out of the abundance of what God is doing and has done in us. And so in communion, we remember that. We think on that. We pray about that. We center ourselves on that. We bring our anger. We bring where we feel injustice and we say, God, meet me in this. And we cling to the idea that he has and he will. So there's 4 stations in this room, and we just want you to receive and walk in that today, and to let that shape and mold your heart wherever it may be. So let's pray, and then we'll invite you to receive communion together as a community. God, there are some of us that have been part of a community like this for a really long time. So it becomes really rote. Yep, we know what's coming. We know there's crackers and juice. We know that there's a Ravens game and we got stuff in the crock pot. But God, just would you break us this morning of business as usual and help us to just pay attention to what's going on in our own story today, where we're carrying the injustices that are happening around us, where we're carrying the things that have happened in our story, where we're carrying the nonsense of too much to do and not enough time to do it. God, would you help us to receive from you, who is making all things new, how to cling well to your hope in a world that feels hopeless. And would you show us, as we lift up and pray for our neighbors, how we might be part of what you're doing in the world today and this week. We remember who you are, we remember what you've done, and we cling to that as our hope today in the name of Jesus. Amen.